Ready?
It's live, yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Amy Bryant of Parenting Beyond Punishment, and I'm really excited to have Robbyn Peters Bennett with us today of StopSpanking.org. Um, Robbyn is a psychotherapist, an educator, and a child advocate who specializes in the treatment of mental health problems due to early abuse and neglect. Her life's work is aimed at ending child abuse and all forms of violence against children. She's the founder of StopSpanking.org, a nonprofit dedicated to educating the public on the dangers of spanking, and she's on the steering committee of the U.S. Alliance to End the Hitting of Children, an organization dedicated to supporting the movement to end spanking in the United States. Welcome, Robbyn.
Oh, it's great to be here, Amy. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's so great to have you. So, Robbyn and I have been working together now for almost a year since we worked on the No Spank Challenge, and so I'm really excited to have her back with me to share some more information with all of us about spanking, why it's not neurobiologically appropriate, what we can do instead, and how we can talk about it. So I'm super excited to listen to what you say and really have this conversation.
I'm just so thrilled that folks can get online and ask questions, and then they can go, yeah, okay, in theory, that's great, but, and then offer like a real life sort of situation. Um, we were talking earlier about, my doorway into this topic is via trauma because I'm a psychotherapist and I'm and I work with children and adults. So I see adults dealing with the effects of early trauma well into their middle ages. But the interesting thing about working with traumatized kids is you can learn a lot about just people, because traumatized children are just much more sensitive, and so you understand the nuances of how they work. And the study of neuroscience in the field of trauma is just robust right now. It's so exciting. So I thought maybe I could give you a framework to think about the brain of your kid and your parenting style, just to sort of begin to think about where you want to go with how you work with your kids. And let's just see if that helps make sense. So in other words, if you understand neurobiology and child development, then it's obvious that spanking is not a good idea. So hopefully this will help you make sense of it. So three things to take home from this, if you can, is one is that the brain grows sequentially from the bottom up and the inside out. And early development affects ongoing development. So things we do early on affect things that will happen later on. So that's really important to understand, because sometimes the things we do very early on are not apparent in terms of their effect. The effect is something that shows up later. And that's true physiologically as well. Like I was talking with Dr. Martin Teicher about trauma, and he did a study on the hippocampus. And you can look at the hippocampus of little children, and then you can look at it when they're college age, and children that are traumatized, the hippocampus will look the same at the time of the trauma. But when they're in college, you'll see that there's not sufficient development. And of course, that's just one example, but he called that the time bomb effect or something like that. But, that's really important, because later functioning is affected by these early experiences that are kind of invisible to us, because children really appear to be resilient. But what they really are is adaptive. And resilience is something that is developed. It's not something that is inherent. So the first thing is the brain grows sequentially. The second is that if a child has experiences that evoke a toxic stress response in their brain when they're little, that can have a cascading effect. So early trauma, early distress, early adverse experiences have a cascading effect on later development. And the third is that the most important element of ensuring healthy development in your child is to have a secure, safe, pleasurable relationship. It's really about attachment. It's about a lot of other things too, like a sensory soothing, rhythmic, uh, healthy environment, diet, food, sleep, the quality of sound in the environment. You know, for those of us that have a baby, you know all about sound and light and rhythm and rocking, right? All of those are really important too, and always within the context of relationship. And just to say this before, and then we can just open it up and talk about it, but one of the most critical factors in attachment is you don't want an ambivalent attachment with your child. And that's really an important thing to think about, because an ambivalent attachment is going to interfere with brain development for many, many reasons. Now, there was a study out of Princeton. They studied 14,000 children, so that's a huge study, and they found that 4 out of 10 children did not have a secure attachment with their parents. So if you're having difficulty with your attachment to your child, you're not alone. This is a cultural problem. We have some parenting practices that we have invented that are not working and that are interfering. The other thing to think about, there was an interesting article out of the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry that talked about, they studied it was a 22-year study, and they looked at these children at 18 months, and they would do this little evaluation. It's a test for ambivalent attachment or secure attachment. And if the child had an ambivalent attachment when they were a toddler, they studied them as adults. It affected their regulation in very specific ways. There's this thing called upregulation, which is the ability to feel good if you are presented with some positive experience. And downregulation is the ability to manage how distressed you are when you're exposed to something negative. And many of them could do the downregulation, but they did not respond to positive stimuli with upregulation. So the implication is they didn't experience as much joy, pleasure experiences in the brain, and that there's a correlation to early attachment. So we're really talking about the long term here when we're parenting, and what is the level of happiness and ease and joy that our children are going to feel when they're grown.
Right. So let's talk about, how do we nurture that attachment? I mean, what are some of the, well, I guess in the context of spanking, let's talk a little bit about how that is affecting children.
Yeah. If I cough, I'll try to move the microphone.
Okay.
I was talking with someone on this and chewing on potato chips when they went in the other room, and they were like, oh my God, they were horrified. They didn't know what they were hearing. It amplifies sound. Okay, so with spanking, okay, so think of it this way. The brain develops foremost, the most important thing in the beginning is attachment. And then what the brain does in the first 3 to 4 years is it develops its self-regulatory equipment, okay? And that is a physiological experience. It's not just emotional. It's very physiological. It has to do with heart rate, respiration, this thing they call heart variability rate, which has to do with how rhythmic your heart rate is and how sensitive it is to distress. It has to do with reactivity. Does the brain feel reactive? So, and that can be physical, just like a loud sound, how much would that disturb you or cause you to startle? So spanking is a problem in many ways, because one is it creates an ambivalent attachment, because you are now inconsistent. Sometimes you're pleasurable and safe and you feel good and they love you and they feel like you love them, and other times you're scary. And you may think you're predictable because you're cognitive and you're saying, well, here's a consequence and they chose not to and all that. But to a child, actually, often they're not working out of this part of the brain. And so a lot of what they do isn't about making choices, even though we're convinced it is. And so it's not predictable. So you're both a threat, you're also not predictable, and you're scary. So now you've become this ambivalent experience for children. The other problem is it's a physical experience to strike the body. And so that's a somatic sensory assault. And the brain experiences that as a threat. And so it's going to do two things. Your brain, when you're hit, is either going to go into a dissociative state, which means you're going to kind of go away because you can't control it. You're going to prepare to be hurt, essentially, because you can't run and you can't fight back because you're too little. And you're just going to go away. And you don't want that. We all dissociate to some degree, but that's too much. That's a threat dissociation, and it's really hard on the brain. And it can set up a pattern of dissociation, being spacey, zoning out, going away, not recognizing that you need to do something in a situation, rather than just sort of becoming overly passive. The other is hyperarousal. You'll see this more in boys, where it creates a fight response. And so the child can't fight you, of course, because you're big. Some children will. They've got a lot of, spunk. But what it does is it tends to create hyperarousal in the neurosystem. So now you've got a child that's kind of ooh, and spazzing out, and first thing out of bed they're running, and there's no walking, there's no relaxation, there's no deep reverie, because the brain can't relax. So the brain is either in this hyperarousal or this dissociative state. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that spanking will permanently put your child in that state, but it just means that it will contribute to that kind of stress response. And you don't want your child to have a toxic stress response, particularly because if you are the source of threat, it means that you might be in the future. It's much safer if your neighbor spanks your kid, because they don't have a connection. So it's a trauma, but they don't have to live with that person. That person they don't rely on them for love and affection and nurture, and they don't have to predict it. They can just stay away from the neighbor.
Right.
You see, with you, it's a much bigger deal.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that was really well said. We have one question. One participant asks, what defines ambivalence versus secure attachment?
Well, so there's a lot of different tests for that. And it would be interesting, what I could do is go out and pull the test that they did in that particular study. But what they look at in little children is, I'm going to give you a general idea, but I could probably provide the test to you if you wanted to, or the tool that they use if you're curious about it. Just email me. But basically what they look for is, if the mother's with the child and someone comes in the room that the child doesn't know, how do they respond? Do they cling a lot to the mother? Now, if the mother leaves the room for 5 minutes and then comes back, how distressed is the child? Does the child see? Some children that don't have a strong attachment won't even go back to the mom. They won't go, oh, you're back, or come to her or touch her or anything. They'll just be off playing, and they'll ignore her when she comes back. Other children will be very distressed, like super distressed about her going and then coming back. A secure attachment, the child would be happy that the mom came back, but not overly distressed or sort of disconnected from her. Does that? And so, this has to do with how secure do we feel about the person that's everything in our world being there for us.
Mm-hmm. I think that's such a really clear example of how that when a child is hit, it really disrupts that attachment, because, like you said, we're their everything, we're their safety and their lifeline for food and shelter, and
right. And they feel pain, and the natural emotion that goes with pain is hatred.
Yes.
And they can't really hate you, even though they do in the moment. Because they love you, and hatred feels dangerous.
Yeah.
And so they'll often start to hate themselves. And then if you say, well, I did this because you're bad, you're naughty, you did this, you did that, then it sort of compounds that feeling of self-hatred.
Mm-hmm. I think on the flip side, too, is when we say, I'm doing this because I love you. And then that also sets children up for further complications. Well, if my...
Domestic violence, for example, women that tolerate Yeah, women that tolerate being in relationships where men are aggressive to them
Mhm.
because it's natural, because there's a confusion about that.
Right. Right.
And there is a link between early spanking and the increased chance of being in a domestic violence relationship, either as a man or a woman.
Right. Yes, right. Because it is really both genders.
And I think there's more rage and fear and terror in a relationship that's not secure. So if you don't feel securely attached as a child, you live that out the rest of your life unless you do tons of psychotherapy, right? And then hopefully you get better, you
Right.
know?
And even then, I think it's years and years. I'm
It
working.
is. It's a lot of work.
Mhm. I wanted to let y'all know that we're gonna try something different today. If y'all are interested in calling in to ask a question, I honestly am not sure this is gonna work, but we're gonna try it. So
Yes.
I've put up a number up here if you want to dial in, and then once it asks you for the access code is up there too. So you'll dial 712-775-7035. And then when it asks you for the access code, you'll dial in 962-632#.
Can you type those numbers into the chat bar, Amy?
I will, yes. I have a sticky note up there, but I'll type them into the chat bar too. That's a good idea.
Because I don't see the sticky note, but it might be because I'm a moderator or something.
Oh, yeah. I need to be the moderator one time and see how that looks.
So while you're doing that, I'll just say a few things until someone calls in. How's that sound?
That sounds good. And it's going to take a minute. It might not work right now because I haven't joined yet. So there it is. And let me go turn that on while Robbyn talks.
So I'm going to give you the 6 R's. This is Bruce Perry's work on how to respond for healthy neurodevelopment. And I never remembered the 6 R's. I had to ask Amy if she remembered them this morning. So I'm going to give them to you, but then I'm going to give you the 3 R's because I can remember those, which is a little bit different, but is helpful too. Because I'm always thinking about, like, I study this all the time, but, and my kids are adults now, but this applies to really every relationship that we're in. And I find that goes right out the window sometimes, everything I know when it has to do with my own kids. So these little things so these little ideas sometimes can help in the moment, particularly if you're upset. So the first is the sequence of how to respond to distress. And of course, spanking often happens when a child's distressed, because then we get distressed, and then it goes from there. So the first it's relate, regulate, and reason. And sometimes we do that in the reverse. Have you ever seen a parent who's talking, trying to talk the child out of a tantrum, and the child's like getting more and more like out of it? So the first is to connect, is to have a relational connection to your child. And then to think about self-regulation. So the first, how do you connect? You mirror, like, oh yeah, I can see you're upset, you seem really like you look angry, or you look like you need something. And then to sort of get a sense of how dysregulated is my child. Are they spazzing out? Are they their breath is getting shallow? Are they jumping up and down? So you're trying to get them more regulated. And that might be just to move with them, to go, if you're at a restaurant, to go out and walk on the sidewalk for a little bit, or to pick them up and rock them, or whatever they'll tolerate, to sing to them, to crack a joke, to laugh. This is all how to regulate, right? And then when the child is really calm and back in a good space, that's when you reason. So you don't reason when they're upset. And the old style of spanking a child often was you spank them and then you lecture them, right? And it's completely neurobiologically worthless endeavor, because you've basically thrown their brain into the lower brain. Their upper brain that can think and problem solve and have empathy and reflect on their own behavior is gone. It's now offline. And then, now they're in a state of dissociation because you've assaulted them, basically. And then you lecture them. So that's the opposite of what you want to do. You want to relate, regulate, then reason.
Right.
So how's your technical stuff going?
it's I don't know. It's up and running. So if someone has a question and they want to call in, please feel free and I will check it. I will continue to check it as best I
Great.
can. Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think that's one thing we talk about at Parenting Beyond Punishment a lot is the first thing we have to do is to really connect with our child, right? Like your child is upset and you go and you get calm and you, okay, I see that you're having some big feelings. And you model that, being calm. When they talk about mirror neurons, and
Yeah.
when we're able to remain calm, it then helps our child to calm down.
Yes.
Then once they're calm, they're able to learn and to understand something new.
So it's like the way you can think about it is it's like we have a brain map and a that is we have a brain that's developed in a certain way. Maybe we're super sensitive in terms of reactivity. So part of how we build that self-regulation in a child is to co-regulate, which means we have to stay calm. So, for me, it's about, am I breathing? That's the very first thing to be thinking about. What does my facial expression look like? Half the time I don't even know what my facial expression looks like. Particularly if I'm trying to figure something out or I'm upset or I'm worried, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So sometimes what I'll do, big feelings, it's an interesting word. I hear it a lot, but it's never really resonated much with me in that I don't know what that is exactly. But what I've how I've morphed that so that it works a little bit better for me is I'm more descriptive. Like your eyebrows are squished. I wonder if it means. So I'm real descriptive about what I see.
Mm-hmm.
Are my eyebrows squished? What do I look like?
Oh, I love that.
Do I look upset? And then they might say, yeah. And I'm going to say, well, I'm worried, and it upsets me when you're crying. I'm worried. What do you feel? And they might not know because that's kind of cognitive, but they might.
Right.
But just start with descriptions. It seems like you're holding your fists and your face is all squished up, and you look. I wonder if you're worried. I wonder if you don't feel good.
Right.
Maybe you're frustrated. Probably not saying, are you frustrated will work, although I'm capable of doing that. Only because if you throw a question at them, it's sometimes too much. So often it's just throw a description at them, and they might grab onto it. Because it's too hard to answer a question when you're upset.
Right.
It's actually really dysregulating, actually. It's stimulating when you feel good, right?
Right. Well, I know when I'm having a lot of emotions going on and my daughter is talking to me a mile a minute, it's totally more dysregulating. Wait a minute, I can't.
Right, because you're getting sensory overload, right? That chatter is actually not rhythmic. So let me say that, let's do the 6 R's that you reminded me of. So these are really great in terms of trying to figure out how to regulate a child. That whatever you're doing, make sure it's relational. Because, of course, pleasure within relationship is the most potent, marvelous thing. Otherwise, if you're just using sensory sorts of things, like things that taste good or an environment that's pleasing, you really want it to be associated to connection with others, because actually relationship's the most soothing thing. Yeah. So always relational and respectful. Spanking's out then, and probably the way most people do time out is probably out as well. And probably lecturing is out, because it's kind of rude when you think about it. Who else do you do it to? Yeah. So respectful, rhythmic. And that one's an interesting one, but I think it's really important when we get pre-verbal, where it's like we're getting upset. Rhythmic's important. So it could be just rocking, it could be singing, it could be movement, any kind of movement, walking, getting on a merry-go-round, getting in a swing, jumping up and down, dancing, any kind of dance. I was watching that Elmo video. I'm trying to remember who did that video. It was great, where they're like, just breathe. And it's a song, right? And they can sing it to you and you can sing it to them. So singing and rhythm and movement is very soothing to the lower brain. So we're talking pre-emotion. We're not even talking feelings. We're just talking physical regulation. So rhythmic is hugely important. And then rewarding is important. It's got to feel good in some way, either on a physical level or an emotional level. And then The last two are repetitive, which is really important, is that anything you're trying to teach your child does, when you're trying to create a new capability or skill, you want to be sure that the way you're trying to teach it has repetition involved, right? Because repetition is very pleasing to the brain. It's how you learn things. And then the last is relevant. And this one's really tricky because sometimes I'm 46 years old and other times I'm about 5 living with me. Okay, there's times get me really late at night and I'm tired, but I'm too tired to go to bed, and I want to watch a movie, and I want to eat some ice cream, and you could really hurt my feelings pretty easily. And it's like we can do this slippery slope, right? So sometimes I'm brilliant, I think, in the morning, but it's a downward slide all day. And by the end of the day, I mean, my level of regulation is sketchy. And so in terms of what they mean by relevant is, how do you want to respond to your child or your husband or your wife based on where they're at developmentally? It can be where they're at developmentally all the time, but also I think we can see that our children, as well as ourselves, we are at different developmental stages at different times. And so just match it. Sometimes we are like little children and we just sort of need to be sung to and held and loved and eye contact and other times you can expect something more, but always kind of try to be aware of, like with spanking, a lot of people think, well, that child's having a tantrum in the grocery store I'm at Walmart at 11 o'clock at night. It's like, well, why are you here at 11 o'clock at night? Like, well, of course this child's tantruming. I'm tantruming, but I can hold it off, It's like, oh, I'm so tired.
Right.
Or just going to a restaurant and expecting children to sit for long periods of time. We're not built that way, and children are not made to be still.
Right.
So some of it's just about understanding what's developmentally appropriate and what a child's really capable of, and just sort of submitting to that to a degree, right?
Yes. We had a couple of questions, and they're actually both aligned with each other, and they're talking about how can we apply these principles to older children, like teenagers. And one person asks specifically, he says, this is probably not a simple question to answer, but can you address some strategies or recommend some resources to help learn how to counteract the, quote, time bomb, unquote, effect for a teen or preteen who has experienced significant adverse childhood events?
Yeah. No, it's not a simple question. Well, one is just that you understand that, well, for one, in terms of resources, I think Dan Siegel's work is great.
Yeah.
He's very sympathetic and loving towards teenagers. And, I love this book he wrote forever ago, 84 or something, called Parenting from the Inside Out. That's one of my favorites of his. The other thing is, I want you to know about Ross Greene, and that's it's, I think he calls it collaborative, it used to be CPS, collaborative problem solving, and now it's collaborative proactive solutions, but it's the same wonderful stuff. And if you go to livesinthebalance.org, he has regular sessions where you can ask him questions, but collaborative problem solving can be very, very useful for teenagers because it's it's an approach to work with young people that is not about abusing power. It's about true collaboration. And I'll tell you, I was raised in an authoritarian way. I think a lot of us are. And so that sneaks back in when I don't even know it, particularly if I'm anxious. So that's a really great resource. But one thing I would really think about with teenagers is that they have self-regulation problems too, because they're going through so much in terms of their own development, and they can get overwhelmed. So I would think a lot about how regulated are they, and don't be tricked into thinking they're in a cognitive place when they're not. And I think there's something to be said for doing physical activities with young people and teenagers that really address their need for rhythmic experience that's regulating. And I'm a big yoga person. I'm all about yoga, but there's other things and to do it with them, to go exercise with them, to go on walks with them. I think it's a really great way to be with a teenager, particularly because it's parallel. You're not eye to eye. It's not really pushing the intimacy barrier, and they can walk with you, and they get regulated, and sometimes they can address really intense topics because they're walking.
Yeah.
And they're breathing. And Bessel van der Kolk talks a lot, and he has a new book out you might read too. I think is really important because he's going to really look at the lower brain. I think it's called The Body Keeps the Score, is the most recent one. And of course, if this child is really traumatized, you might look at some therapies like EMDR. Certain forms of talk therapy can help. But I like to think about the upper brain and relationship, but also the lower brain. What are we doing to regulate? Are you doing rhythmic, breath-oriented, meditative kinds of things? It's meditation and movement, essentially. And it's very, very good for a hyper-aroused lower brain. Because you've got to keep that lower brain calm. Otherwise, everything's much harder. And of course, relationships the most powerful thing. But you'll see a lot of children will start drinking and all of this. In fact, I always quote this. Sunny Shin did this research project that I'm always quoting because it blows me away. And essentially, it's a longitudinal study that shows that the more a child's been hit, the more frequently they'll binge drink as adults, or adolescents, in their teenage years. And I think it has a lot to do with dopamine. The ability to feel good. So you want to create pleasurable experiences with your teenagers and your preteen, which means you have to really manage your anxiety and your tendency to lecture, which is mine, and always want to teach, which my daughters like. Talk to the hand. Just try to have fun with me, Mom. No more research, please. Lay off. It's right. Right. My anxious self is, well, read this, or but it's not helpful. What's helpful is laughing with them, enjoying them, being with them, and then just being present to them so they can come to you with what they need.
So hard. We so much just want
really
to
hard.
Give them our knowledge and experience, thinking that it's going to help when they really need their own knowledge and experience.
One of my best friends I met when my daughter went through adolescence, and we laugh, we call it a trauma bond because both of our teenagers were going through teenage years together. Mostly because we were so anxious. It's a very hard time. It's very hard on parents. It activates our rage. It activates our terror. It makes us have a direct experience with ourselves and parts of ourselves that we may not even realize are there. And so I think really self-reflection and getting enough support as a parent is really important, in addition to being informed and understanding brain trauma and all that stuff too.
Right. Yeah. Man, having sort of a partner in crime, so to speak, as you're parenting through these years is so important.
Yes.
I have a friend who I text every day, oh my gosh, I'm getting flooded, and
that's so important. Yeah, how do you stay regulated if you don't have someone to co-regulate when you're falling apart? Right. That is so right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear about this caller that has someone, a child in his life that's experienced all of that,
Yeah.
It's very sad to hear that. And I think, though, just the concern and the interest to learn. And the other thing I would say about young people is give them books. Let them read Bessel van der Kolk's work. They'll figure themselves out.
Yes. So he said he says, wow, all great recommendations and ideas. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have another question, and this really is right along the lines of what we want to discuss also. This caller says, hi, I live in the South, and spanking is highly defended and used by a lot of people, including people very close to me. I am very much an advocate for not spanking, but I feel it always falls on hearts and that are not open to listening or changing. How can I share with others in a way they'll listen without getting defensive?
Oh, I don't think you can talk about this without people getting defensive. You know, it's interesting when I first started this work, and I would have friends. I'd be at a dinner party, and they'd be so excited about my work, and they'd have to bring it up with their friends, and I would just cringe because I usually like to talk about my work. But the reason I cringed is because the topic of spanking, I think, really activates early trauma in the person you're talking to. It's not an intellectual argument. It is a deeply emotional one, and it is embedded in the trauma in the body. You know, it activates memory. And when you start to defend the child, just know that when they were spanked, they probably were not defended.
Right.
Which is why spanking continues. If children know spanking's wrong, parents may still do it, but the children will not integrate it into their parenting practices. Like in Sweden, when they banned spanking in the home in 1979, it was very popular, like it is in the South and really all over this country. And they did a huge educational campaign. And all of the parents that grew up under that ban, you know that parents were still spanking. I mean, because it's hard to stop doing it. It's like a huge learning curve. But those parents, there's only 3% support of spanking in Sweden now. And I believe that a big part of that is because the children, even if it was happening, knew it wasn't right.
Right.
Now, the people you're talking to in the South, it's a huge problem in the South. 19 states still paddle children in schools and assault them and bruise them. It's just horrendous, and it's profoundly supported by the parents in those communities. So you have an environment of trauma. So when you talk about spanking, bring it up when you feel good and you feel strengthened. And what I would just say is, you know, I would begin with just saying, for me, I love my child and don't want to hurt them, and I don't think pain is part of education. I'd give them maybe a pamphlet. We have one. You can email me and ask me for it. That is a little pamphlet of two parents talking about the neurobiological consequences. That can sometimes really reach parents because they don't have to indict or be angry with their own parents. Because, of course, you can see where this would bring up the rage they might have toward their parents for hurting them. And they don't want to feel that because they love their parents. And so it creates a lot of confusion, and it's just hard. So it's a deep topic. And I sometimes, I try to always connect. And then before I push my agenda, I might just say, I think the first thing is to ask them where they're coming from. You know, what was your first experience of spanking? You know, what was it like for you? So you thought you were bad. You thought that you deserved it. You know, and that's a very tender place, and that's a place that's hard to go at a dinner party, you know, but that's really where we're going when we have this conversation. And it's why I can promote this on the internet and all of that, but where the change really happens is when folks start talking to other people they love and trust and start healing each other by listening, by really deeply listening. I do it sometimes with strangers. I was in an airport. Did I tell you this story? It was a while back. I was in the airport, and this woman was threatening to spank her son, and I could tell, had behavioral problems because he was really off the wall. And I walked up to her, and I put my hand on her shoulder, and I just said, you know, be kind to yourself. You're doing the best you can. And she just started to weep. And I spent the next half an hour with her telling me about her daughter that she's putting on the plane and how she's mad at her and all this stuff. And my son's autistic and I'm overwhelmed. And the whole time he was hitting her part of the time in the beginning. And then as we talked, and I just kept rubbing her back and listening. And that little boy eventually climbed up in her lap and sat with her. But it's like, you know, it's like there's a lot of pain for people around this. And in the South, people feel like they have to do it to be good parents. So you have to really listen to the belief systems that have been developed around the violence. You know, so you believe that you were bad and that you deserve to be hit.
Right. And people, I think, unfortunately, still believe they're bad. You know, that message.
Well, right. They sure they do. And if you believe you're bad, it's hard to feel good as a parent because now you carry that. So you're worried your child will be bad, or you're worried you won't be good as a parent. We have you start carrying all this anxiety into the relationship. Um, Fear-based parenting is based on the idea that I'm not good enough. And so I always say, you're good enough. You're good enough. You're not perfect, but you're good enough. Right? And you just reach out for support in the ways that you're not, right? That you're messing up.
Yeah. So true.
Parents that punish their children punish themselves. And so anytime you come to them with, hey, this is wrong, they're going to hear it as, you're bad. Even though you don't say that. So you have to remember that it actually hurts. This message is painful for people to hear.
It is. It really is. That story is amazing. I think it's such a clear example that we can look past their behavior and see what's going on inside in them, just like we look past our child's behavior.
Exactly.
To see what's
it's exactly the same.
Yeah, it's exactly the same.
It is.
It's so hard, right? We see this adult body and we think you should be able to control yourself, or you should be able to do better. And we have these thoughts, probably the very same thoughts we're telling ourselves, I should be better, I should.
Right.
But the truth of the matter is, we're all really doing the best we can right now.
Yeah, that's why that idea of relevant on the 6 R's is actually that person is doing exactly what they're wired to do and what they've learned to do. And so they're probably developmentally a lot younger than you think. And it's shocking, really. But it's hard because you see the child that's being hit, so you feel that trauma, or the child that's being threatened and that you know is being hit. And if you have a history of trauma yourself, you feel that. And then you see them as the aggressor, and it evokes in you a rage. It's a lot to process. So being down in the South, I would say make sure you have friends that love you and get your point of view and support you, because it's hard to be in an environment where you're a minority, particularly around this kind of topic. And I know what she's talking about because I was at a dinner party one time with professors of psychology, can you believe this? And lovely people, and they had one of their other professor friends there from the South, and when he brought it up, because I was interested in, like, how could we make this social change and stuff, and this woman was furious. I would spank my kids. I'll let my neighbors spank my kids. She got so mad she walked into the kitchen. I could hear her cussing and talking under her breath in there, and I'm like, oh my gosh. I'd crossed a cultural boundary without even knowing how intensely irritating and judged she felt judged, right?
Yeah.
It's a hot topic.
I'm in Atlanta, and I'm blessed that I have a pretty big circle of people I know and that I'm friends with who are maybe not all gentle parents, but certainly aren't hitting their children. But you go to the grocery store or to Target and you see it and you think, what can I do to support these 2 people right now?
Right.
So
yeah, yes.
It's hard. I love your example. I'm totally going to try.
Oh, every time I go out, I'm like, okay, do I have energy? Where am I at? I'm just down at Lowe's, and the mother's sitting there and the baby's crying and strapped in the stroller and overheated and she's ignoring her. It's like, oh, how do you help?
Yeah.
Boy.
It's so hard. My husband has had a number of experiences at the airport where he's wanted to be able to help and he hasn't known what to do, and so he asked me to, like, do you have a card I could hand out or some sort of words of encouragement? So I posted this to our parenting group, Parenting Beyond Punishment group, and we came up with some really lovely ideas and we printed some cards, and it really was about, you got this, you can do this.
Yes.
Your love will shine through regardless of what anyone else thinks is going through.
Right. Yes. Wonderful. How wonderful. Something like, you are not judged, or something like that. Or I'm not judging you. I've got your back. Just stay in your heart. But the other thing, I have a friend that hands out cards too, and she also will like walk up and put her arm around a kid on the subway. She's wild. I love it. But you know, you do what feels genuine to you. But for me, what I do is I get into an emotional state of love for that person. And until I can find that, I don't do anything. I just wait because, you know, I have a judge in me too. Like, knock that off, you know, like, right? So I've got to get beyond her,
Right.
that part of me, right? I got to get to the place where I'm genuinely feeling love for this person and wanting to help.
Yes.
And I won't say, how can I help? Often I'll just say something gentle, you know, like, um, you know, this looks really hard
Hmm.
and you look like you're doing everything you can, you know, and just connect, because if you can connect with that adult, they can start co-regulating with you
Yeah.
and it'll de-escalate the situation,
Right.
and then the child will be in less of harm's way. So you don't have to get in between per se, unless of course it's really physical assault. It's more like bond with the parent and help them, you know.
Right. Right. Because it's like a child. Once the parent can regulate, they can think more clearly and find
Yes,
alternatives.
yes.
Let me see the time. It is about 12 minutes till 1, and I'm happy to go over if you want to stay, but maybe we can talk about some research-based, parent-tested alternatives to spanking.
Yeah, so, you know, the research, there's, you know, if you follow you know, the journals on child development and that kind of thing, there's a phenomenal amount of research out there. But what we know is that the research is saying that it is about attachment. It's about relationship. It's about having a lot of pleasure and joy and laughter between and in the connection, and that really punishment does not work. I just posted an article recently that showed that punishing children for lying doesn't work. You know, this study just came out showing that, yeah, because, and it sort of makes common sense. So the research, I think, is supporting the idea that it's the fundamental is attachment and then to help regulate. And that develops those overarching abilities of affiliation, getting along with others in bigger social situations, having empathy, being able to think ahead and plan and control impulse. Because, you know, from a brain perspective, the more you build the prefrontal area, that inhibits a lot of those primitive lower brain responses, right? That's why as you get older, you can wait to eat and you can, control certain urges that you have. Little children can't do that as easily. So you're always building into their mind your own brain, basically your own prefrontal cortex capability of managing. That's what the research is saying, is that your brain is put on, it essentially co-regulates and builds their brain. So the most important thing is to make sure that your brain is regulated.
Right. Which
Yeah.
can be really hard, you know?
It is, particularly if you were raised with a lot of stress. So you have to accept the truth of how you really are. You know, you may not be able to push it, and in this culture, you know, I'll just plug one of my pet peeves about our culture is it's too cerebral and it's not physical enough. And mothers are and fathers are in cars and for long periods of time, and children go into classrooms and spend all day dissociating because they have to sit in a chair and be bored, and there's not enough relational feedback. There's a lot of affiliation with peers, but not a lot of adult to child regulating experience. The recesses aren't long enough as far as I'm concerned. And so, it's kind of a sensory deprived environment. And then we wonder why our children are completely strung out when they get home from school, or you say, "How are you?" and they go, "Fine." And you don't even have a clue what that means because they're like, not there. So I think a lot of it is about how do we live rhythmic, sensory rich, relationally rich experiences. Do you, as a parent, have enough time for making love to your partner, to having wonderful meals, for exercising, for going on long, languishing walks where there's no, you know, I mean, I know parents that go years without any of that.
Right.
And those are sensory experiences that help us feel good, that help us co-regulate with our children. So rather than activity rich, I would say um, meandering rich is what we need more of. Yeah.
The luxury of slowing down and not rushing.
Which for all many of us, if we are habituated to being in movement and go, 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 it's actually kind of depressing and alarming and fatiguing to slow down because our system kind of collapses. And all of the emotion that we've been denying by pushing kind of bubbles up. So I think it can be very, very hard to slow down. And that's where we need a lot of support as adults too. How do I get into a relaxed, rhythmic, kind of let's just blow some time
Yeah.
hanging, let's take all day to make soup,
Right.
on the weekend and so maybe all the laundry doesn't get done, but or let's fold laundry together in a way that we just take hours to do that just
Right.
together, like, but to find a way to drop into relaxation and reverie with each other.
Yeah. I just feel more peaceful talking about it like that.
Me too. It makes me want to just go knit.
We have one more question.
Okay.
She asks, what are some things we can say to assure people in our lives that just because we don't spank our children, they are still learning the important life lessons and won't grow up to be spoiled and entitled or criminals, which is something I have had to convey, my family convey to me.
Oh boy. When I went into the juvenile justice system and talked to Dr. George Davis with the New Mexico juvenile justice system about spanking, he said not one child in that system had not been hit. Not one. And that every single one of them had experienced early abuse or neglect in the first 4 years of life. So the correlation between criminality and the lack and spanking is not there. It's the opposite. In fact, spanking makes children more aggressive into adulthood. There's strong correlation to increased aggression, decreased empathy, more relational problems, more impulse control problems. You can see where all of that could get you into trouble. But what I would say to them is that, I really study child development in the brain, and what we know is that children's brains grow with relationship, connection, and relational reward, and that pain actually shuts down the brain in a way that makes it so they won't learn. It inhibits empathy because that is prefrontal. So anytime you shut this part of the brain down, you're inhibiting empathy, cognition, the ability to reflect, learn, and strategize. The verbal skills are shut down. All the things you need to actually have your child really grow and do well. So you can assure them that, in fact, what you're doing is helping them stay regulated rather than in a state of fear. So they are staying regulated through relationship rather than behaving through fear.
Hmm.
Yeah, and behaving through fear, you kind of shut down a lot of parts of yourself. It's very taxing. And that's what that one research study was showing, is it can even affect upregulation. Overly controlled. See, you're teaching your child self-control through co-regulation rather than fear-based control through the fear of being controlled. I keep turning it around in my head, trying to find a way. How do you say it in a way that makes sense to them, in a way that will make sense to them?
Right. And it's part of that whole thing, right? It's that connection. Wow, I hear that you're concerned for my child, and I can really appreciate that.
You can also take the specific, because sometimes this can help. The specific event they're worried about. So did your child tantrum when they went to the store and they thought you should spank them? So you could say, what is it? What happened where you thought I might want to spank my child? And they go, well, she was asking for a treat over and over and over, and you wouldn't give it to her, and then she threw herself on the ground and had a fit. And then you can say, yeah, well, let's talk about what we think really happened there. So what do you think the child needed? You think she needed a spanking? I actually think that what was going on is that her blood sugar had dropped because I hadn't fed her for a while, or that you and I were in a conversation for 2 hours and she didn't connect with me for that long, and so she started to fall apart. Or she's tired, or, in other words, talk about what do you think's going on inside of her. So you can also use it as an opportunity to say, what do you think's happening inside of the child? Do you think she's just bad and manipulating me? I don't think so. I don't think that she's got it together that much to be manipulating me. I think she's just losing it.
Right.
So the benefit of doing it that way is you start to get into their mind about what they think about the child. Because, of course, if you have negative feelings about children, or you assign sort of negative motives to a child, you're more likely to hit them. Lots of research shows that. So what you can do is start working on their hypothesis of what the child is thinking or doing. And you can just assure them that when your child's freaking out, they're not thinking very much. Right. Not a whole lot of thinking going on.
Right. She said, thank you, great response and great examples.
Yeah, it's the examples, isn't it? It's application that is really rigorous.
It really is. It's, it all seems so theoretical until you say, if XYZ is happening, then here are some ways you can address it. And that just really helps. I remember as a new parent thinking, okay, I get that, but what does that look like?
Right.
Sounds.
You have to learn a different way of resolving problems, and you have to be thinking, okay, what's going on inside the child? It's really diagnostic. What is going on in their head? What do they need? What are they capable of right now? Because function is state dependent. So the more spazzed out or freaked out or stressed out a child is, the less functional they are. And the same is true of us. So you're just trying to figure out, where are they at on this continuum? And what's happening inside of them?
Mm-hmm.
They're probably not out to get you.
No.
Even though it might feel that way.
No.
They're just drowning next to you.
They want to connect and know that they're safe and
yes.
feel loved. And yeah. Well, this has been amazing, Robbyn. Thank you so much for coming.
Yes, my pleasure. So great to get live questions. I love that.
Me too. So, Robbyn, if you'll stay, I will end the broadcast. And to let some other people know, if you're looking for support and some ways to parent differently, to really move out of spanking and into more of a connection-centered, attachment-focused way of relating to your child and to living with your child, you can visit us at parentingbeyondpunishment.com. You can also visit Robbyn at stopspanking.org.
Yep.
There's a lot of resources available on both of our websites, and also our Facebook page has a really huge closed group community of parents who are there really to support and encourage each other and to really give ideas of what we can do differently, whether you want to stop spanking or you want to stop doing timeouts or yelling. They're really on board with being encouraging. It's not perfect because we're not perfect, but it's really an amazing group. So if you're looking for support, if you're looking for research, I encourage you to go check out stopspanking.org. And I think that, I'm not sure what, Robbyn, you're doing right now, but I think if you have some questions for Robbyn, please feel free to email her. And
yes, that's fine.
We'll get you her email in the replay link that she'll get sometime tomorrow.
Yeah, and on the website there's a contact form too. You can contact me that way. It's fine too, and I'll be glad to respond.
Oh, good. Oh, thank you. All right. Well, bye, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. And I forgot to change the thing, but thank you so much for being here, and we'll see y'all next time.